Space Force is I would say, yeah, it's a much maligned comedy series from Steve Carell, and yeah, so it's a much maligned comedy series from Steve Carell that was released on Netflix in the aftermath of, I believe, Trump saying something about wanting to militarize space and wanting to be like the greatest force in space. And I think that that's where this whole thing came from, Space Force. So the first season has this whole satirical vein running through it where they keep talking about the president. They never mention the president by name, but they do say things like, "Oh my God, the president's about to send up another tweet," or the or you have displeased the presidents, therefore you don't get any ice cream this week, or something like that. And it kicks off with Steve Carell, who is a four-star general, and he's going into a meeting of the Joint Chief of Staffs because he believes he's about to be given the role of Air Force. He's going to be made the role of Air Force because there's another guy who is in charge of the Air Force who he doesn't like, and he doesn't think is good at his job. But then when he goes in there to say, no, you're going to be given the role for Air Force, you have Lisa Kudrow, who plays his wife, and Lisa Kudrow is kind of like, oh yeah, don't worry, it's going to be fine, and he's there with his daughter, and they think everything's going to be good because they're going to live in Washington, D.C., and they're going to get to the upper echelons. But then they find out that he's been given Space Force, and Space Force runs out of Colorado, out of a back end of a place called Wild Horse, Colorado. So the next time you see them, they have relocated to Colorado. Lisa Kudrow's in jail for some reason, and they never tell you why she's in jail. They never tell you what she did to end up in jail. His daughter's not happy about it. He's running like this whole. He's trying to keep Space Force together, and you have John Malkovich, who plays the lead scientist, who is always coming up with talking about the science, and he's talking about the military, and he has the president yelling at him because the president sees it as like, we've got to go in there, militarize space, and the scientist sees it as a scientific endeavor. And so there's this whole thing where there's some satire in it and there's a comedy in it. And I think because the first season was made in the shadow of Trump, the commentary that a friend of mine, Yatish Palmer, who watched it, because everything I heard about this show said it wasn't that good. Yatish watched it and Yatish said, I quite like it. So I was like, okay, cool. I trust him more than I trust some random critic. I'll watch it. So, and he says that he thinks in the first season, the satire gets in the way of the comedy because you can see that, quite frankly, the people who made this show don't agree with Trump, and they keep having to point out how absurd some of the stuff that you would have to deal with if you were trying to do a Space Force is. When it focuses on the comedy, like the second episode, there's a whole bit where they okay, this is going to sound crazy, but they are trying to get a chimpanzee to fix a satellite in space.
What could go wrong with that?
Yeah, I know. It gets absurd. It gets absurd, and it gets absurd quick. When all these, but I think the standout thing, and the reason I would say watch Space Force, is for John Malkovich. John Malkovich is just brilliant in this. He's worth the price of admission alone. Just watching John Malkovich play this scientist who has had it with all this nonsense around him and doesn't have much time for anything. You don't really get, most of the characters don't really get a look in apart from Steve Carell and John Malkovich. I can understand why some people didn't quite like it but I actually think it's quite good. I think it's quite a good show. I think it's the second season, because the second season was obviously made when there was a different presidential administration in, because they chuck all that stuff about talking about it, and they just focus on the Space Force thing itself. It's kind of neither here nor there. There's only 7 episodes, and there's some storylines that get picked up and they never get put down again, or they never actually get they don't go anywhere. You're like, wait, what about that? And it also does one of the tropes that I think is one of the laziest tropes. So obviously you have a husband and wife. She's up in jail, and they keep telling you that he's going to be in jail for decades. They never tell you what it is that she did, but you know she's going to be in jail for decades. And there's a discussion they have about what that means for a marriage towards the end of the first season, that I think is a really interesting conundrum that they raise. That even had me and my wife saying, what would you do in that situation? And made it a real sort of, and I was like, oh, this is actually, it's not going for an easy answer. But then in season 2, they go for the easy thing, which is out of nowhere. There's just somebody gets served divorce papers, seemingly for a cheap joke, which seems to contravene everything that has gone beforehand. And I was like, what? Why did you do that? And so the second season is weird because you don't know if it was cut short because of COVID. You don't know if something else happened, but there's just something that feels like the second season's incomplete. Like
Yeah.
you haven't finished an arc, you haven't finished the story. It just kind of stops. So all in all, I liked it, but I would have to give it a 3 out of 5. I'm not sure if they're going to make much more, but I know that there's a lot of people who are happy for it, not to, because there's articles that say things like, why has Netflix canceled all this good stuff, but still they're paying to make Space Force, and I thought Space Force was all right. I thought it was all right. It's not the best thing. It's no Brooklyn 99, but I thought it was quite good. Right. So at the